A month, a moon cycle, and if I had my way, also a reading cycle. And back in April, I almost did have my way perfectly. And what do I mean by that? Or what do I mean by a reading cycle? This year, it means that I read one book for each of my reading projects for this year. The Rule of 3+1 project, the Cloud Dancer Covers project, the Year of the Horse project, and the Candy Reading Challenge. And also that I reread a book from my collection and also rescue a book from my TBR pile. This does not necessarily mean I read 6 books a month, because one of the books I read for one of the 4 projects could be a reread or it could be a TBR rescue, and then I get to feed 2 birds with one hand, as the less violent version of the saying goes. And as I said, in April, I almost managed. But you'll notice that I'm giving my April reading report now that we are almost at the end of May. And that is because if April was almost perfect, May was almost a total failure. At this point in the month, I have finished exactly 1 book and I have reviewed exactly 0. But I'm not giving up on 2026 yet. I'm still fighting. Let's see what the rest of the year will bring. But before that, my April reading wrap-up. My first book for April was for the Year of the Horse reading challenge, and that was Michael Morpurgo's War Horse. I chose this as my follow-up to Black Beauty by Anna Sewell because war was the one thing that her titular character did not get to experience, which, by the way, is a great thing because the horses in War Horse, particularly Joey, the main horse character, go through a lot of harrowing experiences and build up a lot of trauma. Though, to be honest, even in the absence of war, even Black Beauty experienced his share of trauma. You need a strong heart to get through these stories written from the perspective of animals who live and work very closely with human beings. One of my goals for this reading challenge was to see if these books with horses in them have common themes, maybe if not stock characters, then archetypes of characters. Or basically, as I like to put it, are these books in conversation with each other? Do they corroborate each other's themes and messages? Do they contradict them? Do the ones that come later add something unexpected to the discussion? And did the ones that came before have important things to say that we have since forgotten? And I'm only 2 books in, but as I said, War Horse is a great follow-up to Black Beauty, with perhaps more emphasis on the bond between men and horses. If it's trauma that you would like to spare horses, that's also because it's trauma we need to spare other human beings. For more of my thoughts on War Horse, I have a review in my playlist for my 5 peer reviews. The next book I read for April was for my Rule of 3+1 challenge for speculative fiction, in which I read 3 books by canonical science fiction authors, my choice of canonical science fiction authors, and a wild card. And I squeezed the wild card in before getting the 3 completed, and that was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. And this was quite the follow-up to the book I read before this, which was The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. There's a sense in which everyone in this book who goes to Mars is also a time traveler going into the future. and not necessarily liking what they find there. Or if they like it, then we, the readers, don't like it. This was surprisingly a downer for something from the golden age of sci-fi, the 1940s, when everyone was, well, as I saw it, so much more optimistic about what the future would bring. And The Martian Chronicles is oddly pessimistic for that age, for the age it came from. What H.G. Wells feared was a possibility, Ray Bradbury seems to have accepted is an inevitability, which is that we're going to mess it up. We're going to mess up the future. We're going to mess up Mars. And the best we can do is rebuild on the ashes of what we have destroyed. It's a very sobering message, and thankfully not the last note with which I'm going to close my look into speculative fiction. So I'm hoping that the next book will present something a bit more positive, something along the lines of what I started this project with, which was Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. But if not, then I'm just going to have to accept that this was a four-movement symphony, mostly in a minor key. For more of my thoughts on The Martian Chronicles, I have not just a review on it, but also a video essay in the video essay playlist, in which I also look at Arthur C. Clarke's short story, The Star, and some G.K. Chesterton. The third book I read in April was for the Candy Reading Challenge, which is the only reading project of someone else's that I'm doing. The prompt for April was April Fool, and as soon as I heard that, the first book that came to mind was Onion John by Joseph Krumgold, which is doing double duty in April as a reread. This is maybe my third time reading Onion John, but my first time reading it when I am closer in age to the adults in this YA novel than to the young 12-year-old narrator. I chose Onion John for April Fool because the titular character is a kind of wise fool. He is the small-town eccentric whom the adults in this novel don't really take seriously, but whom they sincerely want to help. He is a valued member of their community, and they care for him. But the younger characters, the children, they do believe in him and his strange ways and his strange beliefs. And this means that there's kind of a tug of war between Onion John and Andy's father, who doesn't really like the influence that a man whom he thinks is not all there up here is having on a son whom he wants to have a career in science. I didn't expect that I would like this book more as an adult than as a child, because this was written for children. I also didn't expect that I would see his father, who is worldly wise, intelligent, competent, capable, and a pillar of the community. I did not expect that I would see him as another sort of fool figure. The picks for the Candy Reading Challenge are a bit more random than those in my other reading projects, but Onion John happened to have something to add to a conversation that got started in March thanks to another Candy Reading Challenge book, which was Adam of the Road by Elizabeth Janet Gray. And the unexpected question that Adam of the Road and Onion John are bringing to this conversation on reading is whether these classics of children's literature only became classics because they were selected by adults and not originally beloved by children. Because to be honest, if it weren't for the Newbery status, as I said, they'd be out of print. They are not exactly true classics. They're more vintage. I don't know if I will be rereading more of my vintage YA collection, but if I do, I am going to keep that in mind as I continue. The last book I read for April was for my Cloud Dancer reading challenge, in which I read books with white covers. This is inspired by Pantone's Color of the Year, Cloud Dancer, which is one of the many shades of white. So that book was The Silence of Six by E.C. Myers, which is my second thriller for the Cloud Dancer project. Now, I did not really expect the Cloud Dancer books to have much to say to each other because cover design is often accident or coincidence and not necessarily essential meaning tied to the text. In fact, the original cover of The Silence of Six was not white. It was pretty dark, with the dominant colors being red and teal, which is pretty far from what you see here. Having said that, I noticed in my browsing that stark white as a dominant color is pretty popular among the cover designers of thrillers. So it's not really surprising that I'd have 3 books in for the year and 2 of them would be thrillers. I will try to diversify my reading, but I probably will read another thriller before the year is out. The only thing I was not able to do in April was rescue a book from my TBR pile. So as soon as we started the month of May, I made up for it and rescued The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. There is no review on this yet. I hope to get a review up tomorrow. This was pretty interesting and also pretty hard to read. I chose it as the follow-up to The Silence of Six because this is also a thriller, a spy thriller, though it's a bit anachronistic to say that because this came out before we were calling such books thrillers. But it felt like the great-grandfather to the great-grandson that was The Silence of Six. And I wanted to see if there was a family resemblance. And interestingly, there wasn't. In fact, there was more of a reversal, and I hope to get more into that when I finally review this. A lot has happened between 1907, when this came out, and 2014, when The Silence of Six came out. We don't have the same expectations of bad guys and heroes as Joseph Conrad did. If that sounds intriguing to you, I hope you come back for when I finally publish my review. From the past, let's finally settle into the present. What book am I reading now? It is The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. This is going to be my reread of the month. And I decided to read this again because Chesterton was greatly influenced by The Secret Agent when he wrote this. I didn't appreciate this the first couple of times I read The Man Who Was Thursday because I knew nothing about The Secret Agent. But now that I've finally made up for that deficit in my knowledge, I'm really seeing what he did with the grist that Conrad gave him, which is not to say that they're similar. In fact, I don't even think this could be called a thriller. But it's definitely an interesting take on what was scary to the readers of the early 1900s, and what Chesterton, a very original thinker, considered the proper way to confront that fear. If I had made this video a few weeks ago, it would be about the books I want to read in May. Now it's about the books I wish I had read in May but have not started yet. The next book I want to read for my Year of the Horse project is The Red Pony by John Steinbeck. Although the friend who lent me her copy, because I couldn't find a copy anywhere, tried to argue with me that ponies are not actually horses. I don't know if that's true or not, but I am reading this. I chose it as the next book after War Horse because it also takes us forward in time. Black Beauty showed us the late Victorian period. War Horse took us into World War I, and The Red Pony was written in the 1930s, so very likely set in the 1930s. But it's not exactly a continuation because we are finally leaving Europe and checking out the Americas. And it'll be interesting to see if there's any difference between the way horses are treated or horses are depicted in an English setting and an American setting. I will also finally be reading the last book in my Rule of 3+1 project, and that is going to be Congo by Michael Crichton. Why Congo? Well, I started with Journey to the Center of the Earth, which was geographical travel, but, going underground rather than just sticking to the surface of the Earth. Then I followed that up with The Time Machine, which was time travel. And then after that, The Martian Chronicles for space travel. And Congo seems to me to be taking us back from these kinds of fantastic takes on journeys into something pretty basic. So we might not imagine ourselves traveling deep into the Earth's crust or hundreds of thousands of years into the future or onto the planet Mars, but we could definitely make a trip to the Democratic Republic of Congo. That actually connects to my planned reread for May and actual reread for June, which is Heart of Darkness by Eliot Schrefer, which is also set in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Pairing this with Congo is going to be interesting. And by interesting, I mean uncomfortable. So Congo came out in 1980. This came out in 2013. And I would say that they were pretty unproblematic when they came out. I didn't think much of the author's origin when I first read this, and I'm pretty sure that the first readers of Congo did not mind too much that it was written by a white non-African but set in Africa. But since then, we've become more aware of diversity and authentic voices and listening to people who are actually from the places that are featured in books. And while I would like to do that for the Democratic Republic of Congo, at the moment, I cannot. Until then, I am going to read Congo, and I am going to reread Heart of Danger. I am not sure yet what question I am trying to answer about the depiction of Africa, the use of Africa as a setting. I'm sure the themes will start to show themselves as I go on. And all of that is why I am glad to say that the book I've chosen for the Candy Reading Challenge for May is The Checker's Tales, Philippine Mythical Creatures by Joem Antonio. The theme for May is May Bee, as in a buzzing bee. And the challenge was to find and read a book with insects on the cover. And I combed my shelves and could not find anything that had an insect on the cover. Lots of birds, lots of other animals, no insects. But luckily, I was at a book fair where I impulsively picked this up, liking the cover art, liking the concept of, Philippine mythical creatures being featured in, different sorts of stories than how they normally appear in oral tradition. And I did not realize that there were insects on the cover, though you can kind of see the yellow dots against the deep blue background. They're a little more evident in the back. These are fireflies, insects. But the real reason I am happy to be getting to the Checker's Tales is that there has been an unintended trend in my reading for this year. And I know it's unintentional, because something similar happened in my reading for last year. When I tracked everything at the end of the year, I realized that all the books were by women authors, except one. Of all the books I read last year, there was only one that had been written by a man. There's more of a balance between the sexes this year, but where there is an imbalance is that all of the authors have been white. And normally that would not bother me, because when I think of diversity, I think diversity in genre, diversity of time period, diversity of theme. But I guess the zeitgeist has finally caught up with me, and I started to be genuinely bothered that I didn't have authors from more varied backgrounds. So Joem is going to be the first non-white author. There's more of a balance between the sexes this year, but where there is an imbalance is that all of the authors have been white. And normally that would not bother me, because when I think of diversity, I think diversity in genre, diversity of time period, diversity of theme. But I guess the zeitgeist has finally caught up with me, and I started to be genuinely bothered that I didn't have authors from more varied backgrounds. So Joem is going to be the first non-white author of 2026, and of course, not the last. Finally, the book I plan to read for the Cloud Dancer Covers project for May, which will be the book for June, is Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger. Something I learned about J.D. Salinger when doing research on basically blank covers is that there was one cover of his books that he disliked so intensely that he said future covers should be as plain as possible. Just the title, just the author's name. And if you've ever seen the famous white edition of The Catcher in the Rye, you know that publishers have been doing that. Though lately, there have been Catcher in the Rye editions with like a horse on the cover, if I remember correctly. So I don't know what happened to his directive there. But Franny and Zooey still seems to be doing the plain white cover thing. And that's why it's a shoe-in for the Cloud Dancer cover project. I definitely hope I like this better than The Catcher in the Rye. You'll notice that I don't have a prospective TBR Rescue for June. I hope that one of the books from my TBR pile will suggest itself as an answer to or a rebuttal to one of the books I've decided to read. And they'll be starting a conversation that I did not plan to listen in on. As much as I like having a plan, I also like having some surprises. So that was my last Now Next for April, May, and June. I hope that your reading month of May was a lot more successful than mine. And of course, I hope that the next reading month will take me through a full cycle and that I'll have a better reading wrap-up and reading report this time next month.